has been repeatedly expressed in these weeks that the pandemic has somehow accentuated trends already existing, has not really changed the picture of the world as it is. And the picture of the world was already such as to clearly impose upon us the big question: is the US being superseded by China as the new leader of the world or not? Now, China happened to be the protagonist also of the pandemic, which was not expected some months ago. Well, let me say on this something on leadership. We have to say something on leadership, because my personal opinion is that leadership, of course, depends on the economy. The biggest and most important economy of the world is one of the requisites for that country to be leader. Military power, military forces are perhaps equally important. The US, during the last decades, had the first economy of the world, and it was the first in terms of military power, but these were not the only reasons for that country to be leader. You can have the first economy and the first military strength of the world, you are going to be the first one, not necessarily the leader. And the first one is not a leader by definition. A leader is leading the others somewhere. So what also, I say also, made the US the leader in the second part of the last century and in the initial years of this century was the fact that there was a vision, a path for the future, something that has to do, we can go together somewhere. Of course, this role was largely due to the fact that in the first decades, initially it was democracy versus the totalitarian regimes of the first part of the 20th century. The US was leading at a certain point the free world against these totalitarian regimes. And then there was the fight against communism. So leading, you can share the vision or not, this is not important. The fact of the matter is that there was a vision of the world, there was liberal democracy at stake, and the US was the leading country in defending liberal democracy. The first economy, the first military power. Now, it is quite clear that nowadays the US has lost the third requisite, the immaterial, the intangible benefit of the vision around which part of the world is gathered under my leadership. It has been waiving directly this role, mostly with the current president. As Richard Haas rightly wrote a couple of days ago, the current president has adopted the withdrawal doctrine, withdrawing from whatever agreement or threatening to withdraw from international organizations, unraveling the network of international relationships in which this kind of leadership could be exercised. You might say, well, but this is temporary after all, not necessarily the next president assuming and personally hoping that the US will have a different president by the end of the year, well, might restore one way or another a role for the US to lead the rest of the world or part of the rest of the world. Maybe, but in the meantime, the other requisites of leadership, not the intangible, but the tangible, the role of the economy, the role of military forces might somehow go to the side of China. China might be, in a few years, not only the first economy, but perhaps also the first military power. We don't know. Paul Kennedy is now working on, I think it's finalizing a book. I read about it a couple of days ago, Victory at Sea, in which he describes the great effort of China to build a naval force with a lot of specialized kind of ships, etc. And this is quite a change of the picture for the future. Can we exclude that China will be the first economy and the first military power of the world in a few years? We cannot. Can we imply for this reason that China will replace the US of some years ago as the leaders of the world? I humbly submit that I don't think China can be a leader in the sense of the my third intangible requisite of leadership. There is nowhere where China can lead the world to, unless, but this is a separate chapter of our conversation, I don't know we will have the time to go into it, the urgency of the decisions to be taken in relation to climate change, survival of human being in the planet, a roadmap that does not allow delays in this area, might demonstrate that the authoritarian China can do better, more easily, more efficiently than liberal democracies. In which case, the appeal that is already growing of authoritarian regimes, China itself, might create also the condition of a leadership. But personally, I think this is unlikely. Therefore, my conclusion is the conclusion that Martin Wolf was drawing yesterday in the Financial Times discussing these things. We are going toward a world less cooperative than the pre-existing one, much more conflictual and much more difficult to run. And this is at the moment my conclusion.
Thank you very much. A very powerful set of arguments. I turn now to Professor Lisa Anderson.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be with you all, although I wish I was actually with you all, but perhaps next year. I want to make a few remarks that are really drawn on the observations I'm going to be making tomorrow about the shape of the Middle East. But I think in many ways, the Middle East shows us, for better or for worse, our future, which means, of course, it will be, in fact, more conflictual. But I've been struck in listening to the discussion over the last several days by the relative absence of what I think is one of the most important dynamics in the world today, growing inequality. And I think we really need to address that more directly. The accelerating erosion of sovereignty that's been prompted by globalization has clearly brought on defensive reactions among those left behind and fueled populist nationalisms. This is why Trump's supporters seem to share something with those of Orban and Modi and Bolsonaro and so forth. These figures are styling themselves the defenders of local national values, often perhaps inevitably conservative, suspicious, and self-pitying. Craig Calhoun addressed this in his call for a renewal of the nation, national solidarity, which he argued need not be anti-global. As he put it, there's no transnational without the national. But I don't actually think the principal dynamic that we need to be concerned with is global versus local, or liberal cosmopolitan versus communitarian local, so much as what I'll call Davos against the rest. Thanks to both technological change and globalization, and they feed each other, of course, in ways we can discuss, the global 1% has become unimaginably, obscenely wealthy. And in doing so, they have evaded as much notice, even by such an august group as this one, as they might have, because they have very effectively denied and avoided any public responsibility. They claim to be just trying to make a living, protect shareholder interests, innovate, or this is my favorite, enhance value creation. Yet, as we know, the global captains of industry and the financiers of the world have captured many of the erstwhile public servants, the governments and national authorities, touting public-private partnerships, celebrating flexibility in the mobility of goods and services, not to say capital, the importance of liberating the dynamism of capitalism from the heavy hand of regulation. This global elite has awed the world's erstwhile public servants with promises of Ponzi scheme-like rates of growth based on growing and largely unregulated debt financing and leverage. In many ways, the public-private partnership is in fact the modern realization and facade for Marx's observation that the executive of the modern state is nothing but a committee for the managing of the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. I'm sure you remember that. The people, both dazzled and disappointed by the whirlwind of trade deals and tax havens, outsourced labor, and so forth, are beginning to recognize that they are not benefiting. But they are confused, as we all are, about where to assign the blame. The public sector seems shrunken, weak, atrophied, unable to promote and protect the welfare of the citizens. So we don't trust our public institutions or our leaders. But are we really sure that we agree with Klaus Schwab of Davos that, quote, and I'm quoting him, private corporations are the trustees of society, clearly the best response to today's social and environmental challenges? I, for one, am not sure I agree with that. We may worry about the government's surveillance occasioned by the pandemic, but should Amazon and Facebook or Weibo and Alibaba really be developing our privacy policies, deciding on the uses and limits of surveillance? As Avishai Margalit observed yesterday, I think, we see a deliberate undermining of citizenship everywhere, as more and more people are excluded from access to rights by law or, interestingly, through contempt. Have you noticed the language of dehumanization that has become part of our ordinary public discourse? You all know what Duarte in the Philippines sounds like, or Bolsonaro, or even Trump on Mexican rapists and immigrants from, and you'll excuse me, he said it, shithole countries. But it's not just the autocrats that sound like this. Hillary Clinton's reference to Trump supporters as, quote, a basket of deplorables in the presidential campaign was taken as evidence, correctly, I think, of her own contempt for voters. Similarly, President Emmanuel Macron's characterization of protesters as slackers and his distinction between, and I quote, those who succeed and those who are nothing, has betrayed an unbecoming scorn for his fellow citizens. No one wants to be deplorable or despicable or crazed or, worst of all, nothing. But the lines are drawn. If you are not a cosmopolitan, sophisticated, if you are not even really fully human, the language of human rights rings hollow in a world, as Albana, as Manova put it, of the political economy of precarity. Perhaps if being a citizen is out of reach for so many people in the world today, being a consumer might work. You'll remember George W. Bush reminding people that the best way to respond to the 9/11 attacks was to go shopping. He said, get down to Disney World in Florida, take your family and enjoy life the way we want it to be enjoyed. But you have to have enough money to get to Disney World. And if you don't, perhaps being among the chosen, the whites, the Christians, the Hungarians, the Han Chinese, the Hindus, may be second or third best, but it's certainly better than nothing. Thus, I think the divisions in the world are not really liberal or communitarian, not really US or China, so much as Davos against the rest, a reflection of a dynamic capitalism that is producing a world divided between, as Macron put it, those who succeed and those who are nothing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting remarks and very thought-provoking. I now turn to Michael Walzer. Professor Walzer, please.
Well, I want to say a word about what was called the liberal world order under Western or American leadership. What was the liberal world order? And I'll say something about it, its politics, and then something about its economics. So first of all, the liberal world order until '89 was half a world order. And in our half of the world, there were a very large number of illiberal regimes, including some in South America, for example, that were as brutal and authoritarian as any that we see in the world today, still encompassed by the liberal world order. After '89, there was a brief moment when people actually thought there might be an actual liberal world order. But that was a very, very brief moment. And what we saw instead were new forms of authoritarianism, religious revival, radically unexpected by all the liberal intellectuals in the world. And American leadership of this liberal world order, after 1945, we stopped winning wars. This great military machine, we fought to a stalemate in Korea. We were devastatingly defeated in Vietnam. In Afghanistan, after one of the longest wars in our history, we are now negotiating the terms of surrender. In Iraq, we could not defeat either the Sunni or the Shia militias. We have been one of the most incompetent hegemonic powers, I think, in world history, politically, and maybe also militarily. We conquered Iraq in 3 weeks. In 2005, we organized a democratic election in which our candidate came in third, an outcome unprecedented in imperial history. So I'm not sure there ever was a liberal political order, except the US and Western Europe, the wonderful Marshall Plan, perhaps the best foreign policy that we ever had was that moment in the late 40s. So there was this small liberal world, and we ruled parts of the rest of the world, not very competently. I doubt that inequality in Brazil is greater now than it was in the 50s and 60s. Probably was greater then. So I'm skeptical about too much celebration of the liberal world order. And now consider it economically, which Lisa has already said some very powerful things about that. I guess the US brought some kind of stability at quite a price. The liberal world order was a time of multinational corporate aggrandizement on an extraordinary scale. Globalization has been largely the work of corporate elites. According to economists, there's been some reduction in world poverty, which may have been maybe turned around by the pandemic. There was certainly rising inequality in many of the developed countries. So I'm not sure I would want to celebrate the economic side of the liberal world order or of the age of American hegemony. That age is past, but I'm not sure what is coming will be all that different. We are moving back toward a world of spheres of influence, and there will be, I hope, an American-European sphere of influence, a Chinese sphere of influence, and possibly some smaller spheres, an Iranian sphere or a Russian sphere. And we will have to worry about wars at the margins of the spheres, which is what we always had to worry about. Korea and Vietnam were wars at the margins of the American and the Soviet spheres of influence. And that's a real worry. And it may be that before the spheres settle, there will be more wars or civil wars around the edges of American-European hegemony and Chinese and Iranian and Russian hegemony. I think that's a world that can be managed politically, even militarily. The really hard question is whether it can be managed environmentally and economically. And there, I don't think you should count on American management, even if the Democrats win the election. America will be less engaged than it was in the aftermath of the Second World War. What we really need is an American-European partnership to manage whatever part of the world we can manage, and the European role has to be important. I've been saying this for years. America needs a partner strong enough to say yes and no to the American government, and that has to be European. That has to be your work, and I just hope you are up to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Another sobering intervention, and I'm really grateful to all three of you for putting together these talks. And I would like to give you three the opportunity to respond to one another if you would so desire. And then we also will be, of course, collecting questions. So if there is any one of you three who would like to just follow up on something that you heard, I welcome you. And if not, I will go right away to our first question, which comes from Albena Asmanova. George, I see.
Mentioned, all right. Something that Lisa said, yes, we should not leave the legislation on our privacy in the hands of corporate leaders. Just let us remember, however, that our states have given that authority to those corporate leaders. Just this week, some NGOs leaked information that in 2017, the European Commission issued an appeal to medical companies to start developing a vaccine, and they said no thanks because there is no profit in this, and so the European Commission left the issue there. So it is our political authorities that are granting that responsibility and that authority to the big corporations, and this is what we need to be pushing against. Right.
Thank you, Albena. Would anybody like to respond to that, or shall I?
Well, let me just I think that's true, but of course, who's been lobbying our political authorities but the corporates? So I think they really are. We need to see this hand in hand.
Right.
I'm going to go now to Najib George Awad.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists for this interesting contributions. Allow me to be candid and to share with you my thought about that question of who should or who would lead the world and what kind of a leadership such a leader is going to manifest. In my humble opinion, I think the mere involvement in asking these questions in the midst of the crisis we live in right now and the world is in is irresponsible, if not irrelevant. Asking these questions now seems like, to me, like a ship wrecked deeply by a lethal storm, and the passengers are spending their time sitting around the table thinking, who is more qualified than others to lead the rest of the passengers in jumping into the lethal ocean? It's like putting intellectually, scientifically, the cart before the donkey. Something I personally come originally from Syria, and I proudly supported the revolution against Al-Assad, and I supported the opposition. Now, in year 2013, which is just 2 years after the revolution started, all the different oppositional factions started to clash against each other, asking the question is, who among them is more qualified to lead Syria after Al-Assad? And they did that before they even ousted Al-Assad. We are academics. We are professors who have an obligation before our students to be scientific as much as we can. I humbly think the mere idea of leadership per se is irrelevant totally to billions of humans who are suffering at the moment in the world, like all of us. In the midst of the pandemic, I don't think we can really usefully speculate or theorize about leadership and who's going to lead and what kind of leadership and who's best to really make the world work better and be sure that the theory we will make will really apply to the world after the pandemic. We are still in the pandemic. We are still suffering from it. And I humbly think anything scientifically we say about such questions will be either psychological sentiments or subjective speculation. Sorry for speaking too long.
Oh, thank you, George. Would any of the panelists care to reply to that, about the usefulness of these?
Yes,
these
yes, because we have to understand each other upon the sense of the question about the leadership. We are not here to decide who is the best of our group to lead the others. It's not a matter of selecting the best one when we speak of the leadership in the world. It's a real substantial problem that has to do with the reality of the world. The world works better, whatever the issue at stake, if there is more cooperation than conflict. And this can be taken as a basic principle. Cooperation is higher and more intense if there is a leadership. Because you may like the leader or dislike the leader. You may share the goals and the visions or not, but there is more cooperation, and therefore a common decision can be more easily taken, and right or wrong, you go somewhere. Of course, an entire world in the hands of the Nazi Germany would have a leader and would take the wrong decisions. It's too obvious. I mean, I don't need this kind of example. I certainly know that in relation to climate change and to the needs that we have to face, the fact that the previous leader of the world took a separate position and said, I'm not coming with you, destroyed any serious possibility to find a useful agreement. Because with the main economy, transport system, industrial system of the world remaining partially out of the agreement of Paris, you find yourself in a sort of mess. So the point is this one. Do we think that we could face the issues we have to face at the moment of the pandemic, when the pandemic will be over, the economic consequences of it, the policies that will be needed, the investments of all over the world to remedy the injuries, etc., etc. Do we think that a cooperative world would face all these things better or not? If we don't think that it would be better, we may not care about the leadership. The fact of the matter, because this was my conclusion, very close to what Michael was also saying, is that we are not going to have leaders. We are going to have a sphere, as he was saying, of influence. I don't know how much the US, if it continues like this, will have a significant sphere of influence, and taking crucial decisions for the world. Just balancing different spheres of different influences will be quite a tough job for human beings.
Can I join in here? George's intervention was heartfelt, but I'm not sure what he wants us to do besides wring our hands. I would be very happy if there were a global social democratic movement addressing the inequalities that are visible now in the pandemic, both in countries and across the world, challenging the 1%, dealing with the environmental crisis. But there is no such global politics available to us. The crucial decisions about our future are going to be made within nation states in Europe, in America, in China, and in a few other places. And we need to think very seriously about how those decisions will be made and what we hope they will be.
Anderson, yes.
Jonathan, I'm saying.
May I bounce back and say one small comment?
I just wanted to let Lisa Anderson reply, and
Okay.
then I'll come back to you.
This is going to be quick, and it's a very, it's apropos Syria as much as it is apropos the conversation today. But one of the problems with using the uprisings in the Arab world as cases in point is that it was precisely because many of the revolutionaries did not want to assume leadership and did not want to think about how to organize for the post period, that the authoritarians were able to recapture control of the dynamics. So I think precisely it is important in the heat of the moment to be thinking about what the future is going to look like and how one might be able to shape that a little bit.
Thank you. Let me let George.
I saw there is a good question about Europe that suggests to me to take the point made by Michael Walzer and to revert it to offer to the other speakers. And the substance at the end of the intervention of Michael, the issue was a kind of request to support from Europe. He wanted to ask Europe to help the United States to improve their international performance. So one question is, will be Europe able to represent such a power, capable to put again the US on the track of a good Western leadership? And there is a question of Angela Fernandez de Castro Amaral is saying, but there is any moral risk that the European are working as a colonial power, which is also a legitimate question. So question is divided in two. Will be Europe able to do that? And the second, there is any more the risk of a colonial oppression driven from Europe?
Michael, would you be willing to take that?
Well, one of the promises of the EU was that it would create a new Europe, whose economy would be as large as the American economy, and whose political influence potentially could be powerful. Now, you have encountered difficulties along the way, and perhaps that the hope of those early years is fragile now. But I still believe that there is the potential in the EU to exercise, to do good things in the world, and to push America to do better than we have been doing.
So the presumption is that the European Union countries acting in the present context are acting on a more liberal democratic basis than they were in their colonial incarnation. I suppose is part of the assumption. But I see there's a question from Francesca Tarocco, and I wanted to turn to her. If you are we able to hear you, Francesca?
Jonathan, the question about what Europe can do, it's also a question for Lisa and Giuliano Amato.
Sorry, please. Giuliano Amato, would you like to address this issue of the potential leadership of Europe and the appropriateness of
well, listen, I would be happy for it, but I think that Michael is a little bit optimistic because at the moment, the condition of Europe is just better than the American one for the simple reason that on the whole, we feel more at ease because we don't have the American president. But this is just the only significant difference to our advantage that I can see at the moment for structural reasons. You see, I mean, the idea that liberal democracy, meaning by liberal also open to social policies and therefore to the social democratic project, is clearly linked to a good role exercised by Europe. This is, I am convinced, exactly like Michael, that the alliance between the US and Europe in the world of today might have this good meaning, somehow influencing each other positively in this sense. But we have to cope with the structural reasons that make today the necessary policies difficult and that make liberal democracy so fragile vis-a-vis what? Vis-a-vis the progress of populism, of nationalism, of majoritarian democracy or illiberal democracy, as it is named by one of its inventors, Viktor Orban in Hungary. Now, we have to think of the reasons for these political developments to be so relevant and significant. And the reasons has to do with the economic and social inequalities that have grown so heavily in the last decades, creating dissatisfaction, anxieties, anger, and substantially breaking up the social compromise that capitalism and social democratic values have succeeded in realizing, obtaining in the past century. This is the point. With inequalities growing, social ladder that has remained paralyzed, no prospects for the future, lower salaries, etc. People abandon the loyalty toward the political visions they had in the past and are ready to follow leaders and political movements that go nationalist, that go majoritarian, that go illiberal. That's the point. We are still dealing with this problem. So the question is, do we have the reasonable prospect that this is going to change, that the pandemic gives us a hand to change toward the right direction? Because if this is so, if we succeed in rescuing the social environment for our visions and policies to prevail, at that point, the US-Europe alliance might make the sense that we want it to make. Otherwise, I don't know. And we know that there are intellectuals and scholars nowadays who have several doubts about the future because they don't know what's going to happen. Now, I must say, and I finish immediately, that after all, the consent toward policies aiming at sustainable development, where sustainable means both from the angle of the environment and also socially, are more and more. That mostly after the pandemic, people will say now it's time not only for the shareholders, but also for the stakeholders to be protagonists and beneficiaries of economic life, etc., etc., etc. I mean, this is a change that is occurring, but let me notice that in Europe, the only political leader that seems to have these things in mind is an old leader who is happily recovering from a difficult situation of months ago, Angela Merkel. But if I look at the new political leaders, I'm not so optimistic.
Lisa, there were some points that were echoed in that last response. Is there anything that you would like to add to that, especially in terms of what kind of opportunity might have been, or what kind of opportunities might yet emerge as sort of institutional windows for the state to play a lot of these roles that you are I think, correctly suggesting it might rest from the hands of private corporations, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I essentially agree with both, with all of the remarks that have been said about this. I think the, the capacity to think about whether Europe is going to be able to resume a constructive role in supporting and harnessing the United States is, it's an open question. I don't think it's clear. I don't think it's clear that the United States is going to resume the kind of quasi-constructive role it ever played in the past. I think Michael's earlier observations that are sort of, nostalgia for that liberal moment might be a little bit blinkered. And I just want to say one thing about the observation about whether were the Europeans and Americans to resume the kind of collaborative relationship they once had, whether that would be an opening for neo-colonialism. I actually think one of the interesting things that's happened in the last 50 years is the extent to which what was once a global divide between the liberals at home in Europe and the North Atlantic and the imperial domains in the rest of the world has been internalized in Europe and the United States. Immigration has changed the complexion, literally and figuratively, of the countries around the North Atlantic, making some of those tensions actually now domestic issues. So if you look at the United States and you look at the impact of the pandemic, which is one of the reasons why I think it is appropriate to be thinking about these questions in the midst of the pandemic, this is not a disease that doesn't discriminate. It does discriminate. It is very clearly much more damaging to communities of color, to poor people and so forth, than to the elite of the country. So in a sense, you see the pandemic playing out at the domestic level, some of the kinds of things that we used to think of as global imperialism. So I think it's going to be a pretty complicated, sort of pulling apart what's local, what's domestic, what's global, what's transnational, what's international institutions and so forth. But I do think that this is the moment to be thinking about this because, of course, you know, the post-war World War II world was designed during the war. So we ought to be doing a lot of important designing right now.
Thank you, Lisa. And let me turn now to Francesca Tarocco before turning to the chat where some students have begun to enter their questions as well. So please, Professor Tarocco.
Hi, yeah, I'm no political theorist or political scientist. I'm really a historian of China. And so, you know, many of the things you say are fascinating to me, but not really exactly what I work on. Something I've been struggling with, though, when I read a lot of the reporting, you know, in the US right now, and I've been working for many years also for an American institution, for the New York University in Shanghai, so living in a very cosmopolitan city with a very cosmopolitan, you know, student population, and very diverse student population, perhaps one of the most diverse student populations I've ever had in my whole career, and seeing, you know, teaching that kind of classroom, so very much in tune with what Lisa says about, you know, thinking about the future, dreaming up the future, and what Angela Morici was saying. One thing that's always strikes me is that one doesn't seem to be thinking in the West, right? One doesn't seem to be thinking about peace. We always somewhat, while we are thinking about politics or economics, we think about the military. We think about war. We think about power, and we think about the elite and the hegemon. All this terminology is a very, far away from many of the sources I deal with in my daily life, thinking in terms of medieval Chinese history, as well as, you know, post-medieval and late imperial Chinese history, where a lot of the language is about peace and maintaining stability and maintaining and creating consensus. And there are, in fact, if one looks back at the historical record, many, many, many centuries of exactly that in terms of, you know, whatever we call China now, in terms of maintaining equilibrium through various means, diplomatic, religious, and so on and so forth, you know, in that very vast part of the world, which is, you know, Eurasia, as well as the Sinosphere. And all of that really was done through, you know, gift exchanging, you know, agricultural means, sustaining economies, creating other economies. And it's true that, you know, the world is a different place now in the 20th and 21st century. But I think a lot of that is still very much present. A lot of that language, a lot of those means were, you know, through Buddhism or through the creation of ecological system, even in the minds of you know, very much secular members of, you know, and whatever you want to call them, you know, the people who run the show right now in, you know, in China, the Sinosphere, and Southeast Asia. But yeah, that kind of, I don't want to use a strong word, but I don't want to say ignorance. Let's say how oblivious, you know, Americans and Europeans seem to be of that world. And they don't even want to think about that. And they don't even want to bring up the term peace ever in this conversation. Seems to me very striking. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any panelists who would like to respond to that, Michael? Lisa?
Well, I think it is very important now to recognize the role that China is playing in the world. One of the difficulties with recognizing the possibility of a creative work outside of China is the need to recognize the destructive work going on inside China with regard to the Muslim minority in the northwest, northeast, northwest, and with regard to Hong Kong. But the Chinese have spent huge amounts of money in Africa. The money is loans, and many African states are going to turn out to be incapable of repaying the loans. And then the Chinese will be forced, I hope, to forgive much of those loans if they want to retain their influence in large parts of Africa. And I think we need a division of labor of that sort. We need Chinese investment in parts of the world where that investment can do good things. We should welcome it. And we should hope that they discover how much it costs, and that they decide to pay the costs. And that's part of what I mean when I think about spheres of influence. That's the way they get established. But right now, how the liberal Western democratic world deals with China's internal politics, that is a very hard question, and probably our response is going to be largely gestural, but I at least hope the gestures are strong ones.
Thank you. Would any other panelists care to reply right now? So I have another couple of questions that have come up in the chat. One of them builds on that last exchange regarding the potential role of China in the fight against the coronavirus as an opportunity to achieve a new level of world protagonism, and whether or not this could be something that we see. And another question coming from Stanislav Molchanov is a quote: "If we were to treat billionaires as a policy failure, perhaps if we were to go so far as to compel our legislators to pass bills outlawing extreme wealth, could we mitigate some of the harms of global inequality?" He then continues, "We would have to think up new ways of valuing people, and that might require a change in how economists consider economic productivity. But at least that would tamp down on the damage done by the prosperity gospel." May I invite the panel's thoughts on either of those questions?
I'm happy to take the question of billionaires as a policy failure, because I think that's a lovely way to put it. Yes, I do think that we should treat billionaires as a policy failure. It's not clear to me that simply outlawing being a billionaire is the final response that we might want to have, because it depends on what then those taxes, and that's presumably how we would ensure that no billionaires developed in the future, how those taxes are deployed. It would require strengthening a public sector that has been eroded for some time. So yes, I think packed into that question is a whole set of things that we need to be thinking far more about. How economists value people would be an interesting place to start.
Thank you. President Amato or Michael Walzer?
I agree with everything Lisa just said.
Thank you.
I was struggling with my microphone. There were two questions. Of course, billionaires are not helpful in convincing people that our liberal democracies are the temple of democracy and equality. And the evidence offered not by having the billions as such, but this has always been my main conviction, that billions create separate lives, create that kind of phenomenon against which there were the revolutions of 3 centuries ago. The fact that their children don't go to the ordinary schools, that they don't choose the means of transport that other people use, the fact that they are a sort of separate kind of dynasties, that whatever kind of mobility we can create, we will never reach that separate paradise of human beings that is separate as it, and this paradise for something that has gone wrong in our systems of governance, whatever they are. So this remains even in systems in which social mobility does exist. This remains as an injury that creates tension. Can you imagine the impact of this tension when instead of having social mobility, instead of having for my children the hope of a better future than my own life, I understand that my children will have a worse future, a lower income and lower prospects. So this is part of the difficulties that liberal democracy nowadays has, and that creates a question mark on the future. Let me say on China that I am an old friend of the Chinese. I went to China for the first time immediately after they got rid of the Gang of Four. So it was in 77, 78, many, many years ago. And I found people very similar to the Italians for many, many reasons, very similar to the Italians. And at the time, I had the expectation that President Deng arriving, there could be developments leading toward a more liberalized economy and also a more liberalized political system. What is difficult for me to accept there is the fact that it seems that despite the partial liberalization of the economy, the political system for them has to remain as it is, with the firm centralized authority of the party. And don't tell me, now a member of a constitutional court, that the constitutionality of their laws is decided upon by a commission of the party. This is something that I personally cannot accept. There is no reason that convince me of something like that. So this problem for the future exists. It is correct that they want peace. I can't imagine the Chinese army arriving somewhere else the same way as the US Marines arrived somewhere else. So this is relevant for the future balance of the world. But an authoritarian system like that is, in my view, in a good position to run China, but not in a good position to lead the outside world.
Well, my point was really only, it was a call to, knowing more about each other. As I said, I'm a historian, so I deal with pre-modern materials, and I'm not, what I see in these pre-modern materials, and I see that reflected in many of the language and the politics, and the, let's forget about all that, whatever Neo-Confucian rubbish. But, there are all these older layers about creating stability and creating prosperity that are very much alive in people's lives and in the mentalities and the cosmologies that still constitute that part of the world. And I think that, to ignore that and to not dream of possibilities that emerge from, multilateral engagement based on mutual knowledge, and not just the assumption that, that this particular historical formation that is the West is the only one that has produced, as I said, language, ideas, and methodologies to prosper and to create prosperity. And I agree, of course, very much with you that the party state is, in many ways, dreadful. And I've lived, I speak Chinese, I've lived in China for many years, and all of that, I know exactly what it means. I know exactly what it is to be a Chinese passport. Well, I'm not one of them, but I know very deeply what that is. I was there since in my 20s, so I have a very profound knowledge of the place. But what I'm saying is that I find it striking that stereotypes are reproduced constantly in the language of political theory and political science. And so anyway, that was the point. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to just turn quickly to Jose Casanova because we only have a minute left, but please, Jose, go ahead.
I actually agree very much with Professor Tarocco. And this was the model, of course, when China was not part of the Westphalian system. And all the model of discourse comes from the experience precisely of the Westphalian system, and it was globalized. The problem is that China, of course, has become now a nation state and reproduces precisely this model. China could solve the problem of the Uyghurs, the problem of the Tibetans within its own imperial system. But now, of course, it cannot recognize Chinese outside of China, needs to incorporate them into the nation states, so cannot give autonomy to Taiwan, cannot give autonomy to Hong Kong, and cannot give precisely the difference, the plurality, the pluralism that was part of the Chinese empire has been destroyed by the model of the nation state, which they have imported indeed from us, from the Westphalian system. So now we are in trouble, because I think that for the Chinese, although still those cosmologies are there at the personal level, I think at the institutional level, the model of the nation state is basically reproducing in China the worst aspects of precisely the Westphalian model.
Thank you, Jose. And there's much more conversation to be had on that topic, as well as on the really fascinating topic of the future of social democracy, which I know Albena Asmanova wanted to revisit. And I'm sorry, especially speaking as I am from the jurisdiction of Senator Elizabeth Warren, I'm always happy to hear about new policy proposals regarding billionaires. But I would like really to thank very sincerely our three speakers, Lisa Anderson, Giuliano Amato, and Michael Walzer, for making this such a fascinating and thought-provoking roundtable. I'm truly grateful to each of you for the time and thought you dedicated to this, and to everyone for participating in the conversation. And thanks, of course, to our poor suffering translators as well. I know that our microphones are not ideal, and please accept my apology on our behalf. And I invite you all to reconvene in just 13 minutes when the final panel of today's Venice seminars will conclude with Professor Sudipta Kaviraj and Professor Adam Seligman.
Wait, Jonathan, there was a change in the program. Najib is going to be there together with Adam Seligman.
Apologies, I was reading off of a different printout. I'm sorry. Okay. One in about 10 minutes.
Okay. See you in 10 minutes.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Right, East Coast. Good. I would, if Sophia would allow us, and does allow us, I would now pass on the floor to Sandro, who is going to chair the next session.
Yes, thank you, Volker, and good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, actually, for those who are in the United States. My name is Alessandro Ferrara, and I teach political philosophy at the University of Rome II, Tor Vergata. I've been associated with this seminar since the Istanbul time, and then to the Venice time, and now this new edition. And my pleasure and honor to chair this session. And I'm just now going to introduce the two speakers to you. We will hear first Professor Najib George Awad, an Arab American originally from Syria, theologian, religious scholar, author, and poet. Professor Awad is the professor of Christian theology and Eastern Christian thought, and also the director of the PhD program in Islamic Studies and Christian-Muslim Relations in Hartford Seminary in Connecticut in the United States. And he was educated at King's College, University of London, where he finished in 2007. And then he got his habilitation from the University of Marburg in Germany in 2014. His monographs in English are God Without Face, ? On the Personal Individuation of the Holy Spirit, 2011. Then, And Freedom Became a Public Square, Political, Sociological, and Religious Overviews on the Arab Christians and the Arabic Spring. This was 2012. Then Persons in Relation, an essay on the Trinity and Ontology, 2014. Orthodoxy in Arabic Terms, a study of Theodor Abu Qura, Trinitarian and Christological Doctrines in an Islamic Context, 2015. And then a book in 2018, Humayyad Christianity, John of Damascus as a contextual example of identity formation in early Islam. And he has a forthcoming new monograph by the title After Mission, Beyond Evangelicalism, the Indigenous Injiliyun, forgive my pronunciation, in the Arab Muslim context of Syria, Lebanon. And he's working right now on a research project on the Mu'tazilite Kalam in the period between the 3rd and 9th century of the Abbasid era. The second speaker will be Adam Seligman. Professor Adam Seligman is professor of religion at Boston University and research associate at the Institute on Culture, Religion, and World Affairs there in the same university. He has lived and taught at universities in the United States, in Israel, and in Hungary, where he was Fulbright Fellow. He lived close to 20 years in Israel, where he was a member of Kibbutz Kerem Shalom in the early 1970s. His many books include The Idea of Civil Society, 1992, then Inner-Worldly Individualism, 1994, then The Problem of Trust, 1997, Modernity's Wager, Authority, the Self and Transcendence, in the year 2000, then with Mark Lischbach, Market and Community, 2000, and then another book in 2004, Modest Claims, Dialogues, and Essays on Tolerance and Tradition. Most recently with Weller, a co-authored book, Rethinking Pluralism, Ritual, Experience, and Ambiguity, 2012. His work has been translated into over a dozen languages. He is director of CEDAR, which stands for Communities Engaging with Difference and Religion, and an organization that leads seminars every year on contested aspects of religion and the public square in different parts of the world. And Professor Seligman lives in Newton, Massachusetts. Now we're going to hear, I leave the floor to Professor Awad. The title of his paper is Democracy Without Democrats, Identity Formation in Religions. Colin, the challenge of cross-pollinating self-perception in the post-Arabic context. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Ferrara. I first should thank you for chairing this panel. And I am honored to be co-panelist with Professor Seligman. I look forward to hearing his paper indeed. And it happened that geographically we're neighbors. I just want to thank especially Fulker for kindly changing the timing of my paper. I was supposed to read my paper tomorrow, but I have another commitment. I'm very sorry. I'm not going to be with you tomorrow. So I'm grateful to Fulker, and I'm definitely grateful to Fulker and Sophia for coordinating my participation in this conference. As you all realize, I'm theologian and historian of interreligious ideas. I'm not political scientist. So the past 2 days were highly educating to me. So I enjoyed just sitting there and listening to most wonderful, highly esteemed scholars in the field. And I thank you all for accepting me in this circle. In my paper, I'm allowing myself to take us out of the American and European context. I'm gonna take us in a virtual journey toward the Arab-speaking Middle East, if I may. That's a context I know more. That's a context I belong to. And I hope you bear with me as I do this virtual journey with you toward it. And I'm going to avoid speaking about COVID-19 pandemic. And I hope you will bear with that, because I know it's something we live in. It's the major crisis that humanity is facing at the moment. But my paper is gonna touch upon something that is more directly crucial to the Arab-speaking world at the moment. Not that the pandemic is not important. I'm not undermining that. It's just the subject of the conference, which is on between individualism and communitarianism, or community and individuals, is very much relevant to the Arab-speaking context from the perspective of identity formation and the influence of religion on it. So that's why, to be scientifically close to the context of the Arab-speaking Middle East, I chose to share with you reflections on the subject of the conference in relation to the influence of religiosity on identity formation in that context. In 1994, at the aftermath of the first Gulf War, and as many scholars reflected conviction about the delay of the Arab Islamic world in riding the wave of democracy that stroked the shores of Latin America and Eastern Europe, the Lebanese scholar Ghassan Salameh edited a book on the conditions, horizons, and possibilities of democracy in the Arab world. As a title to his anthology, Salameh chooses a quite intriguing title, Democracy Without Democrats, with a question mark. The significance of this title stems from its thought-provoking connotations and discussion-triggering meaning, which the reader is invited to via the main approach of most of the volume's essays. Most of the book's authors reflect a rather skeptical stance on the Islamist appreciation and incorporation of democracy. They argue that one should not be over-optimistic about the political Islam's hospitable attitude towards democracy in the Arab world. The careful and meticulous observer of the Arab world during the Cold War till the last decade of the 20th century can easily find out that political Islam's adoption of democracy is no more than a purely pragmatist beneficial strategy. Their growing interest in the usefulness of democracy conceals, in fact, an aspiration at creating alternative, hegemonic, exclusivist, monolithic political systems, according to the authors of that anthology. It extrinsically wears a democratic-like mask and figuratively calls itself the representative of people's democracy. Underneath this figural democracy, the authors argued, it motivates itself by an attempt to exploit the democratic performance in the service of constructing ideological, dogmatic, and collectivist statehood. This time, however, on the basis of religion and religious asabiyya, partisanship, bestowing the authority of decision and policymaking to theological and jurisprudential legislators and inaugurating in society an age of Sharia rule and Asabiyya's discourse. In sum, most of the contributors to Salame's anthology argue that the offspring of a possible marriage between political Islam and democracy is a democracy without democrats. Over 25 years ago, Ghassan Salame and his colleagues then talked about the possible option of democracy without democrats in the Arab world. And here we are today, witnessing what suggests that this phenomenon has sweepingly claimed the Arab world and is digging its roots deep in the soil of many Arab countries, if not all of them, in fact. This reveals before our eyes the catastrophic results and outcomes that originated from the imaginary, artificial, and mere facade democracy that Arab societies and states are identified with today. The most crucial question today is what grants such non-democratic forms of democracy longevity and sustains its presence and resistibility against any reformation or evolution attempts in the Arab world. What makes us realize that the Arab society's democratic structures and rules of governing fail until this moment in breeding democratic societies and seeding democratic mentality and Weltanschauung in the public? In the remaining of this reflection, I will attempt at conjuring an answer to these inquiries by suggesting that the main challenge and barrier before true democracy in the Arab societies is the defected identity formation and self-perception the majority of the Arab public is still entangled with, which is based on a religiously grounded self-otherizing and an alterity shaped after contrariety. There's something quite fundamentally wrong, I believe, in how we, the Arabs, perceive ourselves and construct our civil, socio-political, and cultural identities. We tend to reject the alterity that lies in interrelating to the other as a correlationally fulfilling and enriching other. The other is always deemed the title of the alter enemy, or the contrasting counterpart. The one who is not only not me, but also the one whose otherness threatens my becoming myself. During the 20th century, the Arab world drifted intellectually after the dream of creating its own nationalism or nation identity. That was not a unique Arab dream. Until at least its last quarter, the last century was the climax moment in the process of the modernist socio-political identity formation that was obsessed with creating a nation or nationalism-based self-perception. Authors like Ernest Gellner and Benedict Anderson already told us that nationalist identities were considered the saviors of society and the dawn of the people's disengagement from primordial ties to kin, religion, and local communities. Nationalism-founded self-perception meant, as Thomas Erickson states, that kin ideology, feudalism, and religion were no longer capable of organizing people efficiently. This identity formation rationale became, according to Gellner, a functional replacement of older ideologies and principles of social organizations. Now, on the macrocosmic level of the public and social Sitzleben of the collective public existence, the outcome of this nationalism-based identity is a form of perception that is centered around the concept of nation state. Now, this macrocosmic level of analysis is not my concern in this essay. My concern is about the microcosmic level of the individual's self-perception. On this microcosmic level, nationalism meant majoritization and criterialization of the scope of belonging and affiliation, wherein the unification of the nation overrides in importance and referentiality the diversification of this nation's groups and individuals. The one not just oversees the many, it also patronizes it and determines its fate. This absorption of the many in its attention to the individual particularities and distinctions of the self by the one in its centralization of the hegemonic principle of commonality and accommodationism has proven itself a total failure on the public scene of the Arab world. The Arabic Spring revolutions are just the climactic manifestation of that failure and destruction of such identity formation process from within its very own kernel and by an inherent lethal crack to its own crust. The Arab Spring revolutions informed us as observers that under the boiling surface of the burning self-perception sphere in the Arab world, a new process of self-perception, a different and contrasting identity formation trajectory is about to erupt. The past 10 years of the aftermath of the first Arabic Spring phase relate to us today that the birthed new identity formation strategy or rationale that seems to be prevailing over other forms of self-perception in the context of the Arab world is an identity formation process that is not just narrowly individualist and soloist in its nature. More problematically, I believe it is crudely religious in orientation and alterity. It is my conviction that one of the most destructive ramifications of the radical changes that wreaked the Arab world havoc during the past 10 years is the retreat of the Arab publics back into rooting self-perception in a radically otherizing and alienating, dogmatically religious and ideologically metaphysical and theological self-perception. The Arabic Spring failed in restoring and healing the Arab societies from the past failure of nationalist identity formation because it failed in preventing the followers of pan-Islamism, pan-Christianism in this part of the world from replacing ideologies like pan-Arabism, pan-Syrianism, and pan-Phoenicianism, for example. The followers of the new forms of religious pan-isms succeeded in taking over the public squares and to impose their religion-based identity formation strategies over the public scene. The Arabic Sitzleben needed a spring discourse that will realistically refuse to identify people before each other by means of their religious convictions. The individual's Christian or Muslim or any form of religiosity is not one of the constituents of the human person's personal identity, and it should not be so. At least this is what I believe. The basic constituent of a human identity is a human person. One's religious belief is a personal, private, and existential choice which every person is entitled to make or not to make. It has nothing to do with the matter of uniting one person or community with or dividing them from the others. It has to do only with one's self-reconciliation and self-relation. What the Arab world missed 10 years ago and still misses today is a conscious, coherent, and systematized rejection of turning religion into the identity formation's primary and most referential constituent. What it needed was a public realization that shaping identity after religiosity would actually rip religion itself of its real and actual nature. Religion by nature is not an instrument for self-definition. Statements like I am Christian or I am Muslim do not actually say anything specific or definitive of me or on myself. Now, if the term Christian or the term Muslim defines the me or the myself truly, this will make one's own self the subject and the object that is the sole content of the thing that is called Christianity or called Islam. This entails that the person is the content of his or her very own religion. It implies that the person worships him or herself. He or she is the core focus of one's own self, as much as it will entail that the terms Christian and Muslim will be reduced to the self of the one who defines himself or herself by means of them. When religion is used as an identity formation criterion, or a criterion to identify not just humans, but everything related to human existence, intellect, and awareness, religion then becomes a tool for otherizing and contrariety. It becomes an expression of confrontational and contrasting alterity, which only states that oneself is categorically, ontologically, and hierarchically different from the self of others. When I say I am Najib, Christian, or I am, let's say, a Muslim, etc., what I state does not actually designate anything about exactly who I am. It only makes the others realize that what I am not. I am not Muslim. I'm not a Jew. I'm not a Buddhist. I'm not a Hindu. I'm not atheist. I'm not non-religious. I'm not agnostic, etc., etc. I am Christian does not aim at making my identity known to others. It rather says, I am not the other. It does not say who I am, but that I am not what others are. Be that as it may. Defining who am I in terms of a religion does not say anything about me, and it eventually fails to specify anything about the connotations and meaning of the Christianity and Islam I define myself with. Turning religion into an identity follows a Hegelian dialectic that presumes that the self cannot be itself except in contradiction with a conjectured other, whose otherness is often imaginary, pre-constructed, and far from realistic. This is exactly what we practice in our harmful and dangerous relation with religiosity in the Arab world today. Rather than becoming one of the incentives of interculturation or cross-pollination, the identity formation experience becomes a process of otherizing, wherein self-identification turns into an act of exclusion of otherness. Here, clinging to an a priorically constructed religious awareness centered around contrariety transforms exclusion from an expression of self-distinction into a dangerous state of violent divisiveness, especially when the religiously divine subject considers the religiously perceived other a potential contaminating threat to oneself and one's own religious superiority that drives both subjects into violently negating each other. And a good example of that is actually the Shiite-Sunnite clash in the Middle East. The religiously founded otherizing self-perception I talk about here is not an idea or a mere intellectual view. More dangerously, it is an action. It is a strategized modus operandi. It is a behavioral habitus that is granted the status of a defining and categorizing process. It is that intellectual and cognitive process of self-defining by categorizing the other in such a manner that not only emphasizes who I am, but it also presumes premeditatedly and preconceptually that the other cannot, let alone is not allowed to be the same as I am. The other is not entitled to be looked at and appreciated as one who stands with me on the same level of existence, nature, value, and rights. The Arab societies have not yet liberated their Sitzleben from the trap of the obsession with affirming one's own difference on the basis of confirming a state of totally dialectic contrast with some imagined, constructed, or degraded other. The young post-Arabic Spring generations succeeded actually in saying to the entire world that they are not so and so. They succeeded in demonstrating their standing outside, or their dream of standing outside, the boundaries of the conventional Arab identity formation. They gave us the impression that they are traveling beyond the frontiers, or trying to do so, of any identity formation process, as the Tunisian philosopher Fath al-Maskini describes, be it the secularist one that controls identity by means of freedom, or the religious fundamentalist one that withstands freedom in the name of identity. What the Arab youth are still unclear about and still unable to clearly articulate is what they truly want to become. Lacking this cataphatic self-perception, they consequentially found themselves sweepingly dredged by the more organized and experienced voice of those who promote religion-centered identity formation strategies, like the radical Islamists and the radical Christians, by the way, in the region. Being better organized, more experienced in political affairs and occupied with power and authoritarian prerogatives, these radicals, Christians and Muslims alike, took over the public squares and replaced the decaying and collapsing old nationalism-centered systems. Religion is not an identity, and it must not be so, for this is neither the role of religions nor is it the core of its messages. In the Arab world, countries like Iraq and Lebanon almost vanished as states and as nations at the very moment when its citizens started to define themselves by virtue of their religions and confessions. Also, Syria is at the verge of vanishing as well, as its citizens started to define themselves by virtue of their religions and confessions. The Arab world in general treads onto a direly dangerous phase that lies in a comprehensive constructional fragmentation, the primary instrument of which is obsession with religiosity and using religion as the main defining criterion. If there is a promising Arab Spring, it lies in an exodus from turning religion into an identity and bringing it back into its original realm of personal conviction and pure privative choice. Back to square one. Why what we witness in the Arab world is a situation of democracy without democrats? I tried to suggest in this paper that this has to do with the identity formation and self-perception strategies by means of which religiosity has turned into the central and primary constituent of self-identification. This process of identity formation that seems to linger around the Arab public scene and manifests itself in ferociously radical political Islamism and political Christianism empties democracy from its basic nature. Democracy is not against religious affiliation and the personal or even the communal commitment to religious convictions. Thus, democracy is not to be associated automatically with either atheism or atheist secularism, the thing that the radical Islamists repetitively insist on doing to justify their war against secularism in the Arab world. Democracy rather invites the religious individual to relate to the different other on the practical level of coexistence as equal. It also invites both to realize the symbiotic condition of being which interconnect each one of them to the other without erasing their alterity. It only facilitates a context of public and republic interconnectivity and cross-pollination that protects alterity and distinction from turning into contrariety and conflictive contradiction. This is why, in my opinion, something like consensual democracy, a democratia tawafuqiyya, which the Lebanese pride themselves about, is an example of a democracy of non-democrats. Democracy by default is the system of moderating and overseeing discrepancies and the absence of consensus. When there is consensus, then democracy is no more. It is not needed. To maintain the democratic essence of any democracy, you not only need to ascertain the correct practice of the democratic game, you need also to change the core perception that the practitioners of that democracy hold in their minds about who they are and what defines and decides who they are. Is it a logic of I am what the others are not? Or is it the logic of I and the other become what the cross-pollination of our coexistence turns us into? The emancipation finally from the state of the democracy of non-democrats may actually lie in reconsidering and re-understanding the identity formation process that permeates the Arabic societies in the post-Arabic Spring era. What is needed is a self-perception that moves beyond the boundaries of parallel and tangential existence with the other on the basis of dogmatic or religious dividing identifying lines. A self-perception that lies in the notion of cross-pollinating symbiosis, a state of selfhood that stems from reciprocal transformation and interpenetration, wherein self-giving and self-denial do not preclude self-existence and self-affirmation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Najib, for this very passionate paper. And I'm sure there will be, I see already questions here in the chat, and I invite people to raise their hands or make known their desire to ask a question. If not,
Professore, il microfono, your microphone.
yes, okay.
Yeah, perfect.
I start with this question by Belkis. That's the name I have here. The Arab Spring is the climax of the failure of the nation identity, as you said. But how can you explain the fact that in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, the elected decision makers are authoritarian ones? Tunisia and Egypt as examples, and in some ways pro-nationalists.
You mean after the Arabic Spring, right?
After in the aftermath.
Yeah, that's exactly the dilemma that made me dig in during the past 10 years after what could make people who fostered democratic election, right? And fostered that public practice of the democratic game, turning when they reach to power into authoritarian dictators without the army costume.
Yeah.
Because and that's why I agree with Ghassan Salame that what we managed to do in the Arab world is creating a democratic game, but those who play the game don't have a democratic perception of how to be democrat in your relation with the other and in your self-perception. That's why I'm bringing it deeper into self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
I think by nature, when you cling your self-perception to ideology or a dogma, and these are things that are easily developed within religious logic, then you tend to inevitably start looking at the other as always what I call here in a dialectic Hegelian manner. So unless you create the other in a way that will resonate with how you feel you should exist, the other become a threat.
Yeah.
And I think that's really the root of that outcome. And that's why the Arab Spring so far probably failed. And we need a second Arab Spring, but hopefully learning from our mistakes.
Thank you. There's another question by Rui Marques Pinto from Germany. And the question is, the problem of identifying the self in Arabia is not a question of the lack of enlightenment as it happened in Europe. Is not the lack of a state as an arbiter that facilitates the construction of the self according to the will of man, where Orientalism can be a middle ground for building democracy plus democracy. That's the comment. It's more a comment, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we have to decide first, what do we mean by Orientalism? And that's an endless discussion about how Orientalism is to be approached. Some connotations of Orientalism are so negative. There are voices now in the Arab world that are trying actually to embrace some Western attempts at maybe, in a way, rereading Orientalism or revising it. And maybe if Arab intellectuals succeeded in that attempt at rereading Orientalism in a way that will make them approach it objectively, this might help them re-relate to the Enlightenment and to the Western experience in a new way. Mm-hmm. But I personally believe that as the crack is within the crust of the Arab world, healing it must come from within the Arab world.
Okay, yeah.
I think that's important. And in that sense, we don't need Orientalism. We need to recreate our own Orient.
Okay. Then I'm following the list here. There's another question by Slimani, that's the name. Can we say that there is an Arab Spring? And the Arab, and the Arab countries, I mean, are the Arab countries living in wars and fragmentation?
Now, I am personally, and probably my answer would not be biased, I have to admit. I believe there was an Arab Spring.
Okay.
Or let me say there was an Arab Spring attempt, really. Those youth who went down to streets really went down with sincere dreams, with genuine dream for change. Many of them in Syria are my friends. Some of them ended up in prisons or killed. I'm lucky I'm out. But those young people really want to change. They want to review themselves. But definitely those, as I was trying to explain in my paper, those more organized sites, like the radical sites who really built their own understanding of the region and themselves on that religious dogma, whether Christians or Muslims, by the way, took over easily because they were more organized, have experience, had resources, etc. And also, I'm sorry to say that, and I don't want to sound accusative here, the West supported the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East. In the first Arabic Spring, Western, I sat during the past 10 years with many Westerners, intellectuals or decision makers in relation to Syria. And I heard their voice. And most of the time, there was a belief, there is a sort of a Eurocentric belief that the Middle East is Muslim. Mm-hmm. And that means it has to realify that Islamic identity on all levels by letting the Muslims create their own entity. But if you ask the Muslims in the Middle East itself, especially these young generations, they will probably define themselves and understand their Islam in a way different from how the Muslim or Christian radical decision makers in the Arab world would define themselves as so, if I make sense with that.
Yeah. I have, let's see, Sophia, are there more? I see one by Tezin Nizar, then 2, 3. Should I group them together, perhaps?
Yeah.
I see Professor Casanova raising his hand as well.
All right, all right.
And Professor Carlo as well has had his hand up.
Okay, so let's have the 3 questions, then we go to, and we close with Jose, and who was the last one?
Volker.
Volker. Okay, now the 3 questions. Tezin Nizar, Pan-Arabism, or lack thereof, could not deliver much as regards the Palestinian question. Similarly, neither Pan-Islamism in the Arab world. However, if we were to explain an Arab world without the Islamic nature of society, that also could not suffice. Where can we locate the identity or ideological factor? That's one.
I mean,
just wait, we have to group 3.
Yeah.
That's one question.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
That's one question. I go on with the second. From Amal Al-Kashlami. Religious identity is well known in political parties all over the world, even though in democratic countries. Why should we deny this identity in politics in Arab countries if it is selected by democracy as well? That's the second question. And the third question in the group is it really, by Mohammed Zakaria Lagman, is it really Arab Spring or an Arab Autumn? How can we talk about democracy in Arab countries when we know that most Arabs are religious by nature, in the sense that religion plays an important role in their lives? Therefore, Arabs automatically tend to vote for the Islamists who raise the slogan, Islam is the solution. Islamists succeeded in taking power, but they have turned their countries into failed states. Don't you think that Islamism represents a threat to the national state and to the human global values?
Let me start with the final, and I will try to be short. Each one of them is a very important question and is worth hours. But first, we have to agree that really the Arabs are by nature religious. Now, this is was really Michel Foucault. This is a language of power. Now, who decides really that? Have we asked the Arabs if they think they are by nature religious or not? Nobody did. Not even the ruling decision-making and ideas creating sites in the Arab world asked the public. Had they listened to the public who went out in the Arab Spring in Egypt, in Tunisia, and other parts, they would have listened to something different totally. That's the last question. The second one, why should we deny the Muslims Islamic identity in politics if it is accepted why don't we learn from the mistakes of other parts of the world? Why don't we learn from that? Why nobody is talking about denial? I'm talking about assessment. I'm talking about critical assessment. Let us critically assess the successfulness of politically identifying the Arab world with Islam. I think this is detrimental to Islam.
Okay.
Personally, I think it's detrimental to Islam to really reduce Islam into a political or state identity, but that's another subject. Now, the first question has to do with
the identity or ideological factor, saying that Arabs didn't do much for the Palestinian question, and Pan-Islamism didn't do much to advance.
That's right. Now, I am an Arab. I am an Arab. I am a Syrian Arab, and I belong to the Muslim civilization, although I'm Christian, and I'm not shy about that. I'm giving an example, lively example, to say an idea here. No problem with defining certain culture, certain cultural context, certain socio-anthropological context with a certain civilizational bearer, namely Islam. My point is about whether identifying the state in terms of an ideological religious identity is democratic by nature or not. Maybe if you ask me, I don't think associating Christianity with states in some Western countries is democratic.
Yeah.
I personally don't think it is.
Okay, we have two more questions. Jose Casanova, Jose, are you there? And then Volker, I'll group them together. Jose?
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to separate the arguments you are making about religious identity. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you, but there's imperfection.
From the question of religious identities, I think that if we look historically, there were, through centuries, religious identities that if we are not linked to the nation state, could live together and recognize each other as different and all kinds of problems. It is when you bring the nation state that the problem begins. So it's not religious identities per se. Look at medieval Spain, but then comes the Catholic Kingdom and Jews and Muslims have to go. 18th century India, you could be a Mohammedan Hindu. It was common to call people Mohammedan Hindus. But then the nation state is not allowed. Under the Ottoman Empire, you have all these groups living together. But then comes the nation state. And the second issue, the issue of the Hegelian recognition. Mutual recognition between master and slave, of course, may lead to conflict. But it's a matter of mutual recognition between equals, which I would argue in the condition of democracy should be the case, of individuals in which this does not need to provoke this problem. Actually, this is the basis for my theory of global denominationalism, the way denominationalism developed in the United States, in which all religious groups recognize each other as different, unique, and yet equal. So again, the question is not so much the Hegelian process of mutual recognition, and not so much the question of religious identities, but the specific context of nation state, and how are then those identities used in political conflicts.
Okay. Volker, let me group together also Volker, so then you give a short closing statement.
Okay, just two quick questions. So if you don't think that religion has something to do with the self, what function can religion have in your theory? Because generally we believe that religion is there to somehow improve the self, to develop the self, to educate the self, to take care of the self, to become somehow a better person. So if all this has nothing to do with the self and my identity, what does religion actually stand for in your theory? Second thing, I'm not sure why you're so skeptical about religion and emancipation. I mean, there are just two examples in world history. I mean, there was Gandhi, who with Hinduism managed to kick out the Brits of India. And there was, of course, Martin Luther King in the US, where you're right now, who to some extent masterly used religion and used religion to emancipate people. So why are you so skeptical about religion in this regard?
I fully agree with Professor Kazan. I'm familiar with your writings. I humbly learned from them. And I agree with you in that association of state nation with religiosity created the clash. And this applies to the Arab context. I do agree with that. And but I still, probably I allow myself to stick to the Hegelian dialectic version, which I think is detrimental. And that's why actually I am someone who believes that the notion of leadership, which we were talking about in the previous panel, is very much shaped by that Hegelian dialectic that is causing troubles and disaster in the world. I think we need to change the entire model, the entire rationale. We have to go beyond that Hegelian dialectic, but that's a subject which needs discussion later. I thank you very much for your, Volker, thank you for your question. I never said religion has nothing to do with the self. I said religion should not decide identity. Now, I acknowledge the role of religion on the personal, individual, private level of self-awareness. But then when you turn your self-awareness into criterion for deciding your relation or belonging or not belonging to certain community, then you take religion beyond the realm of yourself into deciding whether intentionally or unintentionally the self of the others. Because by saying I'm not like them, you are in a way, or by saying they cannot be me, you are in a way making a judgment on them and on themselves by means of that religiosity. And that's what I'm afraid of. In the Arab world, it is because of that turning of religiosity from self-awareness into something that decides your relation to the other, that we have fear among the Christians from the Muslims, that we have hatred between Kurds and Arab Sunnites, that we have historical clash between Shiites and Sunnites. These are all shaped after that rootedness of religiosity in not just self-awareness, but in deciding reality overall in its broader sense and in that communal dimension. And that's what I'm against.
Well, thank you, Najib. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. You'll receive probably more questions via email. And we move on now to our second speaker, Professor Seligman. Adam, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes. I don't see you, but okay.
Okay.
Yes.
He's there. We can see you.
And you can hear me, huh?
My thing.
Okay.
All right, and the title of Adam Seligman's paper is The Tragedy of Human Rights, Liberalism and the Loss of Belonging. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sandro. Good day, everyone, or good evening, or good night, as the case may be. It's a pleasure to join this conversation, and I especially want to thank Giancarlo Bosetti for having invited me to this conversation on the basis of the paper that Silvio Ferrari shared with him. What I'm going to present is really only part of a paper, and the paper itself is only part of a project. The project's been going on for 20 years now. It's not primarily an academic project, although it has produced books and articles and curricula, but scholarly work as well in different languages. But it's really a project of social engagement and establishing different communities of practice in different countries in Asia, Central Asia, East Africa, and the Balkans. So this is less of a theoretical intervention and almost my thoughts from the field. And we can talk about that maybe at the end. So what I want to claim is that in the past 50 years, the rhetoric of human rights has grown increasingly prevalent in political discourse, visions of international cooperation, legitimation of liberal international order. It has also redefined the rhetoric and thought of the left in advanced capitalist countries. Arguments for working class solidarity have increasingly given way to heated advocacy of individual rights, identity politics predicated on multiculturalism and the need of recognition. This workshop is maybe an example of that. I lived in Israel, as Sandro said, for 20 years. I went back on sabbatical in 2017, and all my old friends from the Communist Party and Matzpen and the left, the only thing they could talk about was human rights. This is in some way the genesis of this article, because I was very surprised that nobody was talking about solidarity, let alone international solidarity, but just of individual rights. A politics of rights, which were first advanced as an alternative to what many in the 1960s saw as a threat of global communism, especially in view of the anti-colonial struggles of this era in Africa and elsewhere, succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of its advocates. The individual triumphed. Later, against the background of the fall of the Soviet Union and its satellite states, and the rise of anti-democratic politics in many newly liberated African politics, the rhetoric and country politics of rights came to define what many thought of as the liberal left in the decades following 1989. Liberalism had triumphed as a philosophical project and as a political agenda. At the time, however, the unintended consequences of this triumph were not even dimly perceived by its advocates, and it continues to be ignored by far too many who unquestionably accept the individual unit of human rights as a self-apparent virtue. By making human rights the highest and most noble of our social and political virtues, liberalism has all too often denied, denigrated, or simply turned a blind eye to other equally significant human needs and visions of the good. It is, for example, 70 years now since Simone Weil wrote on the need for human belonging. In her words, to be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. It is one of the hardest to define. A human being has roots by virtue of his real, active, and natural participation in the life of a community, which preserves in living shape certain particular treasures of the past and certain particular expectations of the future. To be rooted is to belong, and to belong is to be a member of a community with its own past, its own traditions, stories, smells, tastes, jokes, obligations, recipes, holidays, moral judgments, boundaries of what is permissible and prohibited, basic frames of meanings, desires, and fears. That is to say, and it is increasingly necessary to say it in no uncertain terms, it is to be a member of a particular community with a particular past, particular stories, particular smells, tastes, and so on. It is not for an individual to merely pick and choose. Belonging requires others, and communities are not easily fungible. The story of the crucifixion and of the exodus of Egypt or the slaying of Imam Hussein at Karbala are not interchangeable. Relations among Mennonites are not the same as those among or between them and Episcopalians. Attitudes of Jews to Catholics are not comparable to those of Anglicans or evangelicals. African-American humor is different from Scottish humor, and both again from jokes in China. Moreover, and critically, these communities are circumscribed entities. These are communities of belonging, are not universal but are bounded, just as families are bounded. They have their own histories and their own trajectories, their own languages and jokes, their own obligations, taken for granted worlds, their own flavors and scents, their own understandings of home. They may be more or less open, more or less ascribed. Their boundaries may be more or less permeable, but they do have boundaries, which always define some us against some them. And both us and them are group, not individual categories. Similarly with belonging contra rights. If boundaries are to include in any meaningful sense, they must also exclude. The terms of inclusion and exclusion are often enough subject to sometimes violent negotiation, historical change, redefinition, interpretation, and endless contestation. But exclude they must, however difficult this may be for many to accept, especially in relation to the hegemonic framing of human rights as universal and transcendent of all group boundaries. The simple logical truth that we cannot have one without the other is all too often ignored. Community among Jews, Christians, Muslims, for instance, and others, is a much heralded virtue, bringing with it not only mutual concern, but mutual aid societies, hospitals, old age homes, schools, charity organizations, burial societies, and much else. it is also often enough oppressive. Within certain communities, we may find an undue concern with what the neighbors eat, how they dress, where they send their children to school, who they marry, and so on. Yes, to be sure, some communities are more restrictive than others. Some define their boundaries in a more rigorous, sometimes descriptive manner than others, but all are exclusive, as any group of people must be if it is to give full meaning to the terms of their community. And it is precisely within these bounded communities, which are moreover real and active entities, that human beings, human actors are born, thrive, live, die, and make sense or fail to of their world and the worlds of others. We cannot live without these communities, and despite all the dangers that arise from them, submit that there is no possibility of human life or achievement outside of them. Again, this is not to say that community is an unalloyed good. It is not. Often it is oppressive and restrictive, even if we discount its exclusionary politics and character. But membership in a community remains an essential component of any shared vision of the good. This is the truth that Simone Weil pointed out during the raging years of World War II, and to which Hannah Arendt drew our attention, pointing out that not only are rights embedded within political communities, but that while we can indeed leave any particular community with its obligations and moral ties, such an act can also only replace one set of ties with another, for life outside a community is not possible. These insights, however, are ones that our current liberal concern with abstract, universal, and unencumbered human rights continually fails to recognize. Now, critical to communities' workings and role in sustaining human flourishing is the moral credit that is granted to their members. What we mean by moral credit is something colloquially phrased as affording someone the benefit of the doubt. As our moral knowledge, social obligations, and sense of what is right and proper, as well as improper and destructive, when this is held collectively by us as members of specific social groups, rather than solely as individuals, an important part of what it is we know is bound up with who we trust. This is an important point. This is not an abstract notion, but a bind in which we often find ourselves called upon to grant moral credit to some source in matters which are by their nature almost always morally ambiguous. We may not dispute any particular fact or set of facts, the building of a mosque in Lower Manhattan, the knifing of a marcher in the Gay Pride Parade in Jerusalem, the murder of a Jew in Paris, the establishment of hidden cameras in the Muslim neighborhoods of Birmingham, England. But the frame of the act, the set of relevant external bits of information, and the histories needed to explain them will frequently be decided on the basis of our group belonging and the moral credit that we, as members of a group, grant to the source of such data. One need only think of the 2016 stabbing of a Jewish man in Strasbourg, France, by a mentally disturbed man who shouted Allah Akbar. All bits of data may be factual, but it is often the basis of one's group of belonging that determine which descriptive bits are explanatory, Jew, or mentally disturbed, or Muslim. Description in itself is always commentary and never plain fact. The context that makes sense of an event is thus always particular, as factual gaps are filled in by our own community's prejudices. Belonging is thus not just an ineluctable emotional need, it is one of the very struts of our cognition and understanding, and as such of our ability to engage with the world. Abstract algorithms may be useful to the workings of Google or Facebook, but they are less than helpful in informing me about how to morally navigate the global refugee crisis, due to the simple fact that it is not global, but a series of endless particular crises spanning Europe, Africa, USA, Asia, Southeast Asia. Now, while biblical injunctions on treating the stranger as yourself would seem relevant in this context, the reality, as we know, is somewhat different. Whether in decisions to prohibit refugee entry into Israel and therein maintain the Jewishness of the state of Israel, where 20% of the population are not Jews, or to keep Poland white, or to return to La Vraie France, or to an America prior to the passage of the Hart-Keller Act 1965, we are witnessing a widespread revival, as we all know, of exclusionary, xenophobic, self-referential politics and ways of life. Needless to add, this is the situation not only in Western and Eastern Europe, but in the United States, Turkey, Russia, China, and elsewhere. Given this well-agreed state of affairs, it is strange and I think self-defeating for those who oppose these developments, as I believe everybody here does, to respond by ever more strikingly advocating those very policies whose political ascendancy has at least in part led to the current crisis. In most cases, the response of liberal left to what might politely be termed communitarian needs calls for a greater sense, of national, regional, religious belonging, is a renewed insistence on human rights as the only morally legitimate arbitrator of social relations. And this, as I am arguing here, is the problem. For it is precisely the abstract, general, and universal nature of human rights argument that so many supporters of right-wing politics and movements take issue with. Rights provide no sense of belonging, appeal to no sense of shared community, and eschew the obligations entailed by already existing ties. To give a sense of what I mean, I'll quote the words of a local Boston ward politician, Martin Lomansey, which he related to Lincoln Steffens at the beginning of the 20th century. I think, said Lomansey, that there's got to be in every ward somebody that any bloke can come to, no matter what he's done, and get help. Help, you understand, none of your law and justice, but help. This is in many ways the heart of the matter. People crave the help and mutuality that comes with and within community, much more than simply the abstract and impersonal application of principles of justice. Now, one could well argue that such claims can be made only when some minimal rule of law is already in place. I agree. But it does not change the reality of people's need for belonging, a need to live among those with whom help is not understood in terms of legalized assistance programs doled out by cold bureaucratic impersonal organizations and welfare agency, but rather as arising out of a sense of personalized mutuality and a shared life. At the end of the day, what Lomansey quote gets at is the huge chasm between enacting a regime of abstract rights and life in a human community of mutual care and shared belonging. That these communities are more and more understood as walled enclaves in the United States for supporters of Mr. Trump, in Israel, Italy, Hungary, in many of the former Soviet bloc Eastern European states, where the Iron Curtain built to keep citizens in is being replaced with new, ever higher razor-wired fences to keep immigrants and refugees out, is a matter of no small concern. But again, arguments for human rights do not properly address the problem. Indeed, they exacerbate it. The question, thus, is how can we articulate a politics of belonging, which we recall always embraces some exclusionary element, without succumbing to the rhetoric of the extreme right, both at home and abroad. While a continued advocacy of human rights may well be necessary, rights by themselves are far from a sufficient condition for human flourishing and the need for roots. Sense of belonging must be accommodated if we are to be spared a replay of the worst horrors of the last century. While there are no easy solutions to this challenge, what I suggest is meeting it head on in the form of developing a new politics of difference, eschewing both the hard and impenetrable boundaries being set up by nationalist politicians between us and any manner of them, as well as the ultimately homogenizing politics of abstract human rights that makes of every individual a morally autonomous agent devoid of inherited ties and obligations, to propose instead a rigorous engagement with communal difference. Now, living with difference is not the same as controlling it. I'll give you an example of what I mean by controlling. In 2018, Denmark began separating one-year-old children of immigrants, quote, for at least 25 hours a week, not including nap time, from mandatory instruction in Danish values, including the traditions of Christmas and Easter and Danish language. Non-compliance could result in stoppage of welfare payments. The aim is clearly not to create a place of difference, but essentially the forced assimilation of these children into Danish culture. It is not a we that is being built, but simply the numerical aggregation of already existing Daneness. The very idea of a we rests on differentiation, but here what is sought is not the coexistence of differences, but its erasure. This is not so different from Napoleon's suggestion over 200 years ago, his attempt to mandate every third Jewish marriage to be with a non-Jew in order to fully assimilate the Jews in Europe. I'm arguing and advocating here for a different approach, for one that takes collective differences as not simply matters of individual preference, but as constitutive of individuals and their communities, a resource to be preserved, however much discomfort may be involved for members of multiple outgroups, and a challenge to be met rather than either ignored through a discourse founded solely on rights or erased by advocates of nationalist and racist policies. Rather than spaces of assimilation or segregation, spaces of difference must be constructed in the military, in schools, workplaces, religious institutions, yes, even in gun clubs, where difference is encountered, wrestled with, sometimes fought over. Only in this way can a shared language and thus a civil politics come to be. Now, while human rights have become the dominant frame for an entire Western apparatus to think through civil society, our argument to this point has been that it has failed. Say this appreciative of what human rights has accomplished in improving the living conditions of many, but cognizant that it is insufficient precisely because its implicit prioritization of the individual at the expense of the individual's belonging. And belonging is something that is necessary for existence beyond the individual. That is, for all existence that is social. As noted earlier, the collapse of the Eastern Bloc led many to advocate an advancement of civil society predicated on the language of rights. The very collapse of communism throughout much of the world was taken as proof that a rights-based system was structurally and morally superior, an approach that would usher in peace, well-being, and democracy through a collective embrace of the Western liberal order. Yet almost 3 decades since the fall of the Berlin Wall, most of those so certain in the success of the liberal order and the rightness of human rights struggle to imagine a way forward other than to continue the course of persuading others to emulate them, to standardize the world in a more uniform and abstract way, a way that minimizes, even trivializes differences for the sake of finding a common ground. And we can talk about that. I can give you examples from Africa. So I've already claimed not everything can be shared. Within religion, this is clear. Efforts to build shared belonging upon the idea of the great monotheistic religions having Abraham as an ancestor in common fall apart, of course, when we consider Jesus, who is seen either as the son of God, a prophet, or a heretic. Such differences matter, for they are central to defining who belongs to one community over another. Human rights imply a universalizing language akin to sharing Abraham in common, part of the story, but not sufficient to define or transcend variations across communities. If we're correct about belonging, then we must turn to other approaches for supporting its development, approaches that recognize difference and the affective and structural distinctions brought about by relations of trust within communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. Now I can see you. It's great to see you again since a long time. And thank you for this really challenging train of thoughts. And there are questions already here. And I see Jose's hand. Go ahead, and then I'll go to the list of questions on the chat. Jose, go ahead.
Hi, Adam. Very good to see you. It's been a while.
Yeah.
If I may allow a joke, your beard has grown much larger than mine since I saw
I got older than you.
Yes, I know. Look, I appreciate very much your critical thrust. I think that the discourse, the rights discourse, is good for some things, but not very good for others. If it's used as the main discourse, then of course it's very problem. But I grew up under the Franco regime. and the discourse of rights had a very important role in fighting the dictatorship. So don't tell me that the discourse of rights is irrelevant. So this is one thing, but cannot be absolutized. This is true. And then the question I have is obviously the question which is crucial about multiple belongings and multiple rootedness. I mean, I'm sure you are deeply rooted in Israeli and American communities, and you have no problem with both. I certainly am deeply rooted in Spain. I'm deeply rooted in America. I'm deeply rooted in Ukraine. It's the language I speak with my son. And when I go to Ukraine, I pass as a Ukrainian because I have no accent. While whenever I speak German or English, I will never be passed as a German or as an American. So the point I'm trying to make is, and again, as you know, obviously I was a member of the community of the New School, a secular humanist cosmopolitan community, but I have no problem being a member of a Catholic community. So the point is that we can belong and be rooted in many different communities. So, and this is basically the argument. I think that you are giving too much of a almost exclusive belongings, this notion of rootedness. So my question is, unless we are able precisely to share many different communities and be rooted in all of them, which is of course the experience of more and more people today, then I think also that the discourse becomes very problematic.
So may I answer?
Sure, go ahead.
So I think it would be useful to separate belonging from rootedness. It might be useful in some cases. I certainly agree with you that we belong to different communities. I don't know if you remember, or if the people here remember something that Avishai Margalit said in his presentation on Tuesday that nobody picked up on, but seemed to me critical. He talked about the conflict in the early kibbutz, not just in the early kibbutz. I was a member of a kibbutz in the 70s for years. The kibbutz, the conflict, the tension between family and kibbutz. In other words, the conflict was between different belongings, not between the individual and the community.
Yes.
So I think it's helpful to say, yeah, let's direct our thought to that problem rather than this abstract notion of a conflict between a morally autonomous, fantasized individual
Absolutely.
and the collective. It's not that. It's always a conflict between different belongings.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's try. From here, let's begin.
That's why I say secular humanism, Catholic. You can be both, no problem.
Yeah. And there's tension between them. And there's tension between
exactly.
Okay, so let's deal with that tension. I just, one word here. I don't think there's an algorithm, but I'm not a political theorist. I think we have to go to every situation and all the people involved have to work it out. And I can give you a good example. Maybe, can I tell a story, Alessandro?
Sure, go ahead.
A brief story about one of our projects we did. This was in Indonesia, in Kupang. We went to the Solar Mosque on a Friday. We waited outside. They wanted to meet us. We wanted to meet them. This was the group of this communities of practice that I'm organizing. And we waited outside in the shade. And they said, okay, everybody now can come. We finished Jummah, except menstruating women. We had a problem. We're an egalitarian community. We don't distinguish between men, women, menstruating, not menstruating. It's an irrelevant category. But our hosts refused to let which is menstruating women into the mosque. It's not their tradition. What do? Well, we want to talk together. We don't want to convince them that they're wrong and we're right. And we don't want to be convinced that we're wrong and they're right. How do we find a solution? Which we did. We found a way to sit around the porch, some in, some out, technically solving the problem without forcing anybody's particular ideology on anybody else. It's this type of micro, small scale engagement that we have to engage in and not sort of grand talk. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Then we have Craig Cahoon. Craig?
Thank you, Alessandro, and thank you, Adam. Again, good to see you and good to hear from you. This is in the same vein as your conversation with Jose. So I'm very sympathetic to the call for attention to both rootedness and belonging and your recent point to distinguish them. You've advocated for and for some years practiced micro engagements of the kind you just talked about. I'm interested in your thoughts about relations across scales of rootedness, of belonging, of identity, and of practice of what we do. So it seems to me that part of what we see in the world, and what was terminologically not very resolved in your talk, although I know you've thought about this in other ways, is a competition among potential Trump card identities. No pun on Donald Trump, just on the idea of a card game, that one card dominates all the others. So there are some identity categories in the world, nation and sometimes religion, which are deployed in this way. If you are in this, it's the only thing that matters, or it must dominate all other things. There are other constructions of identity rootedness and belonging that don't work that way, that aren't equally greedy for total construction of identity. And ironically, there's a connection between the individualism, which you point to in human rights, and the way these categorical sorts of identities of, say, nation or of religion, when it is evoked not in the interior, but as a distinguishing political category that Najib was talking about and so forth, are actually categories of individuals that tend to suppress other scales of belonging, and therefore tend to be bad at both and kinds of belonging, like the sorts that Jose was bringing out. So how do we get past this competition among Trump card identities, saying I am rooted in American society? I'm sure that's a true statement in some sense, but it shouldn't be then a Trump card statement. What's the relationship between these, and how do we then cultivate intermediate scales and multiple belongings?
Okay, excellent. My answer can't be as excellent as the question, but I'll do my best. I understand there are two questions here. One is, how do you scale up from the type of things I've been doing for 20 years? And the other is the second question about identities, hegemonic, and so on. So the first, I didn't want to, I wasn't quite into the conference yet on Tuesday, but if you remember, Michael Walzer sort of dismissed, morally and elsewhere, dismissed the Rousseauian idea of corvée. And of course, it has very negative associations in the French language. But I've been trying to further, actually, in the Defense Department and others, the idea that there should be national service of a year after high school. It doesn't have to be in the military. It could be planting trees. It could be teaching in the inner city. If nobody was exempt, you'd have people from many different backgrounds, rich and poor, religious, secular, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, having to work together as they do in the military, how to solve problems together, and creating over a year or 18 months or however long such a thing lasted, creating a shared history. Shared histories are very, very powerful. They're very powerful in our lives. And we can learn that we could disagree about just about everything, but if we share a history, there's a connection between us. We see things a little differently. I was talking to Rachel about the conference, and I said, I'm sure I would see it differently if I was in Venice, and we were all in Venice, and all together the very sort of, Durkheimian effervescence would change the way I hear the talks. I understand them. I put them in my mind. It'd be very different than sitting in my dining room because I couldn't find a more neutral space, as Sophia asked us to find. Right? It becomes a very, very different event. So the sharing is very important. So that's one. I think this would be a way to try to scale up. This would actually be a way to try to scale up. And again, it wouldn't have to be military. So your other question about identities that trump, it's, again, I think it's, the answer has to be at the level of the grammar of the identities. And let me give you a wonderful example. Some of the communities who are most closed that you can imagine are the ultra-Orthodox, right? The ultra-Orthodox with beards longer than mine and payas, you know, the whole thing, right? They are the most closed, the most insular, the most caring only about themselves, we would think. 10 days ago, there was an article in New York Times that the largest donators of placebo, not placebo, of, I don't know what it is, the blood to see if there are antibodies, came from that community.
Plasma, you're trying to say plasma.
Plasma, right. They came from that community and the rabbis told them to violate Sabbath, which is unthinkable, unbelievable, to, in other words, to violate Sabbath, to drive from upstate New York to Delaware to donate plasma. Not to Jews, but just to donate plasma because it's a matter of human life. So I know my tradition, I know its grammar, I know its language, I know you can find ways. I know you can find ways, and this is an example. And if these guys can find ways, anybody can find ways. But again, you have to come within the grammar. It has to be within the grammar. I was in Karamoja 6 months ago. Karamoja cluster is the area of northeastern Uganda, northwestern Kenya, and South Sudan. I was meeting with our groups, with ethnic groups who practice circumcision, both male and female circumcision. By the way, male circumcision is not what you imagine. The whole penis is involved. It's stripped. It's no less invasive, dangerous, upsetting than female circumcision. And what is happening there? Human rights groups funded from the West, from America, and from Europe go in, distribute money so much that the word for money in this area is NGO, NGO. In other words, NGO has become the word for money. Quote, sensitize the people to what? To Immanuel Kant, I'm not sure. And make the practice illegal, where it goes underground and becomes medically more dangerous. At the same time, the women, let's say, the women who are not circumcised cannot get water, cannot collect dung to cover their huts against rain, cannot take grain from the communal storage, and men who aren't circumcised are nothing in the community. So there are serious implications from coming in with Western presuppositions, instead of working with the community and saying, well, you know, maybe we can just draw some drops of blood, make a symbolic act that wouldn't be dangerous, that maintains the, you know, and the act, the circumcision act is a whole age cohort together. You destroy this, you destroy kinship systems, you destroy the whole society. But human rights advocates are universalist. They don't abstract, they're not aware of concrete reality, but there's a way to solve the problem from within the language, Craig. Whether it's the language of ultra-Orthodox Haredim or the language in Karamoja. But you have to be willing to put in the effort. You have to be willing to do the work. You have to be willing to work with languages that you're not familiar and to be open to change, not just to bring change. And you know, the Open Society program has spent millions upon millions upon millions of dollars advocating an agenda of human rights in Eurasia, and they look around and they're in crisis. What they got was not regimes of human rights, not a multicultural society, but autocratic ethno-national cultures. And they're trying to figure out why, and they're blaming the Russian Secret Service and American Protestants. And I reminded them of what Mr. Marx once said about religion being the opiate of the masses. Why does it work? What does a priest give to a Romanian peasant that a human rights advocate cannot give to a Romanian peasant? Unless you come to terms with that, that's what I mean by belonging, and local in particular, you can't make the progress you want to make. But you have to be willing to learn. You need a certain humility to begin with. Anyway, sorry, I got excited.
I understand Volker had a question, and then we can go to the list. Volker,
I skipped Sandro, I skipped.
Okay,
go ahead.
Okay. Because I have a question that comes now from the list on the chat that comes connected to this point. And it's from Davide Orsito. And it says, in your article, you distinguish between trust and belonging, shared dispositions in the community, and confidence or right brought forward by the liberal rhetoric of the individual. Now, do you think that populism has risen also because of this will to return to trust and belonging?
I think it's connected. I think it's connected. Yeah, I think it's connected. I didn't go into this issue at all in the paper because of time. I mean, in my presentation because of time, but it is in the paper. And I think that, yeah, this goes back to the Lumasny quote, and this goes back to trust being, confidence is abstract systems, confidence is confidence in a legal system. But so what's confidence? Confidence, to go back to Luhmann's distinction, Nicholas Luhmann, confidence is when you can make expectations, make predictions. Trust is what you need to maintain interactions when you cannot predict, when you don't know what will happen. So you're taking a risk. That risk you're much more willing to take among members of your own community than with strangers. It's clear. It's the same logic that's behind the Lumasny quote.
Okay, there's a number of these questions. I'll group 2 or 3 together, then you can comment on them. Rui Marcus says, you said that communities are not perfect. And my question is, to what extent is the community, in your understanding, a social construction? Where do you put the question of power, status, order, and rule of law in your speech regarding the question of belonging? That is one question. Then I have another participant, Shalom Korman, who asks, what happens when the ethics of one's identity clashes with the country's law? Who wins between one's identity, communal identity, and country's law? And then another question, by Amal Al-Kawasmi, what consequences do we have of the announcement of Israel as a Jewish state on the population itself, where Arabs also exist, and they have also the right to expose their belonging? There are some more.
Enough?
Sorry?
Could that be enough? I can't remember more.
Okay, sure, go ahead. Go with those. Yeah.
So, look, maybe this answers. So who wins if there's a conflict between law and identity? Well, that depends on the legal system, because the people in the end, I mean, I assume you meant practically and not morally. I have no idea morally who wins, but the state will decide. The state will decide, and it sometimes decides this way, sometimes decides that way. We have, libraries of cases in it, but the whole realm of multicultural jurisprudence, which is growing in Europe, recognizes that it's not absolute, that you must take account of communal norms that may not, minority communal norms that might not fit into majoritarian communal norms, and tries to find a way. So who wins? The person with the tanks always wins. I mean, this is clear. This is clear, but multicultural jurisprudence does try to find a room, and sort of the theoretical frame of that is legal pluralism. And this goes back to the point that Jose is making again and again throughout the conference, and he's right, is who destroyed legal pluralism? The nation state, the bourgeois nation state. Up until that, there was legal pluralism in Europe. It's only the emergence of the nation state that got rid of legal pluralism. Yeah. Okay. So that's to that. That one way to deal with this is multicultural jurisprudence.
Okay.
Of course, belonging is a social construct. Either you believe that the law comes from God in Sinai or revelation, or you believe it's a social construct. Those are the only two options. So of course there's power and status and everything else. So what? We're human beings. We're not, maybe when we were 17, we were utopists, but now we're too old for that. So of course power plays a role and status plays a role. And I go to synagogue every morning and there's power there and there's status there and everything else. So what? There's that in the university too, excuse me.
Yes.
Excuse me. So about the Jewish state, you're absolutely right. I think I'm not a Zionist. I mean, I don't think the Jewish state, or when I was a Zionist, it was a classical Zionist that was a solution to the Jewish problem, but it's irrelevant. It was, by the time the state was established, it was already irrelevant because nation states were irrelevant. And actually my position was always a federation of socialist states in the Middle East, but that's a different story, speaking of social democracies. However, just to be clear, no one ever had a problem ever in Israel of Arab students wearing a hijab. When it was illegal in Turkey and illegal in France, and nobody had a problem with it in Israel. It was Russia. It was clear that this is, so the issue was never religion. The issue is, national struggle over land. And that was also the basis of repression, not on the basis of religion, but on the basis of nationality, the continued repression, both of Palestinian citizens of the state and those under occupation.
Yes, I have many here. 4. Maybe we could take a couple. Can you take?
Yeah, you
okay.
Decide.
Okay, all right. This is from Belkis. Doesn't this concept of belonging prevent one from integrating, or sometimes even not to be accepted in other communities? Aren't we nowadays oriented towards a more global identity, where we talk about the global citizen who belongs to everywhere? Also, I would like to know your insight about the fact that belonging is a double-edged sword, as one may get lost without it, but also may get hostile and intolerant because of the excess of the sense of belonging. That's one. And then somebody asks, how might Rawls's idea of overlapping consensus address the issue of multiple comprehensive allegiances or identities? Richard Caputo is the...
So this last one first, yes, I do think that it can be helpful. I don't know, are the refugees global citizens? Are the refugees that are kept out of Europe treated as global citizens? I mean, from the halls of academia, we think, global citizens. We go to Venice, we go to Prague, we go to all kinds of places. I don't know, the refugees who are drowning in the Mediterranean are not treated as global citizens. The Africans who are living in horrific conditions are not treated as global citizens. The European politicians who keep people out of Europe are not treating the refugees and migrants as global citizens. So I don't know where this I mean, I know where it comes from, but I don't buy it. Yes, we can belong and we can be integrated, and we might feel uncomfortable and tough. Nobody promised comfort. The Republican idea Tuesday, everybody was talking, Craig and others were talking Wednesday maybe about Republican idea. Republican idea was not about comfort, it was about sacrifice. When I went to the wake of my Catholic neighbor, the open wake, the open coffin wake of my Irish-Italian Catholic neighbors, and I was the only guy with the kippah, I felt mightily uncomfortable. So what? So what? I did what being a good neighbor demands. And when my mother died and they came to our Shiva and they didn't know how to behave, they felt uncomfortable. So what? You can live with discomfort. It's not the end of the world.
Well, thank you, Adam. On that note, thank you. We might end. I thank you and Najib for your both spirited talk and discussion, and those who asked questions, and all the rest of the attendees, and wish you all a nice evening or afternoon, as the case may be.
Thank you, Sandro.
Thank you tomorrow. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Adam. Keep well.
You too.
See you tomorrow. Thank you to everyone.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you.
And say hi to Rahel.
No, tomorrow's Shavuos. I can't be here. Holiday.
See the rest of you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Thank you all and enjoy the rest of the conference. I'm not going to be here tomorrow. So it's been a pleasure really meeting all of you. I'm honored.
Thank you, Najib. Thank you.
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Thank you, Najib.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Great talk.
Thank you, Volker. Bye-bye.
Sophia? Can't hear you.
Yes, sorry, my microphone was off. Hi.
That's okay. Oh, we're set up for tomorrow?
Yep, we're
yeah.
fine. You're the first one. Sorry, let me just end. Okay, that was, yeah, I just wanted to end the Facebook stream before we talked. Yes, we're all set up for tomorrow.
No,
I don't know how.
You know, I deal with this on my iPhone, so I don't know if that's, I've had some difficulty, but I found this thing in a corner. Let's see. Okay, if I raise my hand,
I can see that.
That shows up, right?
Yeah. I can see
Let me
that.
see. Did you see that? Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't think that will the questions they'll appear on my screen? Is that the way it works?
Yeah, well, so it's been working that there's the chat. I don't know if you can see it. I mean, you should be able to see it.
I know that, yeah.
Yeah, so the questions have been kind of coming up through there. And Professor Ferrara right now was saying that he couldn't see the hands that went up. So I was writing to him in the chat saying who had raised their hand.
Okay, yeah.
If that's okay, because I made
Fine.
him, and I'll do the same for you tomorrow. I made him co-host of the meetings thinking that he would be able to see the hands that way, but I guess not. So, so I think that if you're okay with that, I can just indicate who's raised their hands in the chat.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm since I am an emeritus professor, I'm not quite as skilled at using Zoom, although I use it all the time. But I'm not, you know, I'm always tuning into Zoom. I'm not organizing a session. So
I mean, it
I
depends.
do have a dissertation defense.
Right.
Go ahead.
No, yeah, it depends how you would prefer. I mean, if you like at the beginning, and then people seem to get quite used to it. I was reading out the questions that were on the chat just to help out the chairs.
I think that seems to work fine. And it isn't that I'm completely naive. It's